Okay, so today we are joined by Dr. Kat, who has a PhD in human circadian physiology and behavior, an MSc in biosciences, founder and head of sleep health at Somnia, and one of the leading experts in the world of sleep therapy. Kat, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Looking forward to our chat.
Yeah. I've been looking forward to this one all week because it's very rare that we get a specialist in a field that we talk about an awful lot. So it's nice to get somebody who has a ridiculous depth of knowledge on that subject. And obviously circadian physiology and circadian biology is something we talk about an awful lot. I'm sure there's certain things that we can refine a little bit more with respect to what we're talking about. And I'm hoping you can direct us in those areas. But I mean, how did you get into this? This is always a fascinating one because we talk to so many people who have these specialist areas, and there's always, how did you get to that point? So what made you want to study this particular topic?
So I can tell you, it wasn't a clear plan. You know, so many people have a clear plan. I didn't. When I decided to study biology, I actually thought I'll focus on genetics. But I soon realized that, nah, that's not my cup of tea. And I was really interested in the zoology, in the behavior, that's much more. And as part of, you know, sort of the teaching there was sort of some teaching on chronobiology back at university. And when I did my master's project, that had a chronobiological, so that had a timing component in as such that I was studying 3 animal species in the winter time, and their, you know, behavior, their competition, and someone else had done that in the summer. So that's sort of the first time I really came into contact with the timing system, which is what chronobiology is about. It's looking at temporal patterns and rhythms. So I did that, and then actually I went to South Africa to do biological zoological project out there with meerkats. Okay. And that was super fascinating, but that's really when I sort of became more interested in the sleep. And the reason being is that in the summertime, you know, when the sun comes up really, really early, the meerkats, they get up really early, which means us, you know, all the research volunteers, we have to be there waiting for them at the burrow, you know, by 6 o'clock, or sometimes I think it was 5 o'clock even. And compared to the winter, you know, where, you know, that would be maybe 7 or maybe 8 a.m. And I just noticed the difference in mood in the people I was working with. Now, I'm a morning person. So for me, you know, getting up early in the morning is not really a problem. And I'm really happy and, you know, chirpy and everything. But I noticed the difference in people's moods depending on when we had to get up. And that sort of really reminded me of my interest in sleep. And then I have to be honest, I found this PhD that was sort of advertised by the University of Surrey and Guildford, and applied, and you know, I got the position, and then it's just everything fell into place, and I just arrived somewhere or at a topic, as well as the research group, which I really enjoyed.
Amazing. So how many people did this? Was it, you know, this was offered up as a topic, as a subject? It's certainly something I've never seen at, you know, certainly the university I studied at, it wasn't a topic, but was there a big intake on this? Was there a whole bunch of people on this?
No, so actually the project that I did, I looked at sort of sleep in older people and using a light therapy to improve sleep, to stabilize circadian rhythms. That in itself was part of a much bigger project. It was a Marie Curie European funded project with different sort of universities across the whole of Europe. And they all sort of looked at sort of, sleep disruption, you know, influence of circadian rhythms on this from all different angles. You know, some people were working in rats, others in cell cultures, some came from more sociology perspective. So it was a real mix. So while in Surrey, it was actually only me and a postdoc, there was immediately a group, a network, you know, that I became part of, which was amazing. To just to learn so much from all these different fields and areas, because we all sleep, we all have an inner timing system, and that impacts on so many other aspects of our lives, and vice versa, other aspects of our life impact on our sleep and on our timing system. It's really fascinating.
it's a really interesting subject in that, you know, I've been in the health and wellness sector my entire life, you know, as you know, as an adult, certainly. And circadian biology has always been kind of talked about and always mentioned. And it's always had that kind of almost a bit wishy-washy sort of voodoo about it. And it's a remarkable thing, because it's something which is, you know, it's something that there's a huge body of evidence behind. It's something that's been studied for, again, you'll probably be able to reference me, but I'm assuming probably into the centuries, right? They've been aware of this happening, and this timing, and the daylight and the nighttime, and this arrangement of how mammals sort of organize their day around these two real simple things. And people are out there looking at performance, they're looking at improving their well-being and wellness, and minimizing illness, and all these things. And we've got this thing that just is glaringly obvious and glaringly supported and has a massive amount of evidence behind it, but people still look at it and sort of dismiss it. You know, they don't regard it. And I think in, you know, Western culture, obviously we've manipulated times, we've invented the light bulb, and we've messed up all these different things around it. So we sort of disregard it. And I think there's just so much weight behind it that people don't look at it in the light that they should. They're more busy, you know, looking out there for these fast solutions to big problems, essentially. And again, sleep it being probably one of the major ones, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the sleep field, the circadian rhythm field, as research fields, are relatively young. It's been known before, but sort of really researching them, you know, and scientifically, that's, relatively speaking, to other sort of fields, is relatively young. But I think, yeah, people are starting to become more aware of the chronobiology, the timing system, and the big one there, the circadian rhythms, but that's the sort of most pronounced, most dominant rhythms. And the sleep and wake cycle is the best example for a circadian rhythm. And just as a side note, so circadian means almost 24 hours. So in our body clock, in our body, we have a body clock that sits up in the brain. It's about 50,000 cells in a human being. And that sets the timing for the rest of the body. Now, almost every cell has its own clock, and cells that form an organ, like, you know, the liver or the heart, they sort of collectively have a liver clock or a heart clock, and they all sort of, yeah, they can tick with their own rhythm, but it's really that clock up in the brain that kind of synchronizes and coordinates all these other clocks so that they all play nicely together. And a good metaphor I always find is, you know, the idea of an orchestra with a conductor. You've got your conductor that kind of, you know, keeps all the musicians sort of on time, tells, you know, who to play and who to be quiet, and vice versa. And it's very much what our body clock does as well. And what I think we're starting to now, from a research perspective, but much more so from sort of media and public, to understand how important it is, this inner timing, and how much this inner timing matters, as you said, for our health and our well-being, for our performance. Performance isn't constant during our day. It varies, it has peaks and troughs, and it varies also between people. There isn't, you know, you can't say for everyone, oh yeah, you know, 10 a.m. in the morning, that's peak performance. That's not true for everyone. And so the better we understand how the timing works in the body and how it differs between people, the better treatments or performance optimization programs we can develop. And I think for me, it's just another example that we are all different, and there isn't one size fits all. In that sense, there isn't a quick solution to a problem here.
Okay, so people will be familiar, those that are familiar, or the listeners that have seen sort of circadian rhythm talked about, circadian biology talked about, they'll be familiar with the kind of chart which tells you that at this particular time, but there's a lot of assumptions made in that chart. There's a lot of assumptions as to what time does the sun come up, what time does the sun go down. Obviously, they average it all out, and it's all based around, you know, these peaks in blood pressure, peaks in alertness, and all these different things. Now, how How true does that sit, that kind of diagram, if we look at it from a perspective of, if the diagram is built around the sun coming up, how accurate are those timings? Are they normally pretty much bang on?
I wouldn't say so. I think the sequence of things is true. So, for example, we see a peak in stroke incidence in the early morning hours, because that correlates with the heart rhythm and blood pressure peaks and troughs and so on and so forth. So, the sequence is correct, but pinning it to a particular clock time is difficult. And also pinning it to sort of exactly to sunrise and sunset can be difficult, because we see different chronotypes, and that refers basically to the timing when you sleep and when you are awake. And here we see people who go to bed early and they wake up early. We've got people who go to bed very late and then they wake up later, and the rest of us fall somewhere in between. And so your chronotype, as well as, yes, sort of the start, as in the sun going up and the sun going down, they all matter here. So again, the sequence might be right, but I would be careful with pinning it to a particular sort of clock time or even particular position of the sun.
Excellent. So chronotypes, let's expand a little bit on chronotypes. So is there a way of pinpointing what somebody is with respect to a chronotype, or are there millions of them? Is there just a handful of different categories as such that you'd fall under, or is there a way that with any of your patients, do you look at them and go, right, I'm going to analyze first what kind of chronotype you are by using this methodology, or we're going to ask a bunch of questions that might give me an idea of where you are, and then we can work around that and then figure out whether that's correct or not?
Yeah, so you can assess chronotype, and chronotype it's not sort of fixed categories. It's more of a spectrum, with the larks, the early ones on the one hand, and the owls, the late ones on the other. And there's sort of maybe 10, 11, 12 hours between the earliest lark and the latest owl, right? And then the rest of us, we fall along that spectrum, but it's not distinct categories. You can measure chronotype. You can do this through questionnaires. You can also do it via taking regular blood measurements or urine or saliva measurements. And then what you measure there is the concentration of melatonin. It's something I had to do for my PhD. It was sort of ask my volunteers to do regular urine collections, and then I had to analyze them. Not my strongest point, I will add, but you can measure chronotype through that. What I do with my clients, I will just ask them very much about what are your, what time do you go to bed? What time do you wake up? Is this with an alarm clock or naturally? How does that differ between weekend and week, or working period and holidays? Because what we find is that our social constraints, work schedules or schools for kids, these times they sort of impose a different schedule on what we naturally want to do, or what our body naturally wants to do. So yeah, you have to ask a few questions there to really get to it, but you can assess it. And also chronotype isn't something that stays the same during your life.
Just about to ask that.
Yeah, so anyone with little children will know that typically they go to bed early and wake up early, to the dismay of their parents, who quite like to have a bit of a sort of lie-in or stay in bed a little bit longer. And then teenagers, we see the clock shifts, it delays. They want to go to bed late, and because they still need 9 or 10 hours of sleep, they of course then want to have a so-called lie-in in the morning. Now, this delay of the clock in the first instance has nothing to do with blue light exposure, so phone or laptop or tablet.
Yep.
It's a natural biological phenomenon that the clock delays, that sleep time delay when we're teenagers. Of course, blue light emitting devices, they make matters worse, but they're not the driving force here. And then when we are in our sort of 20, 21, the clock shifts forward again. And then it sort of might be relatively stable for a number of years. And that's really when we see that spectrum that I was describing, you know, with earlies and lates and intermediates. And then there's another shift when sort of women are going through the menopause, and also for men, it's not entirely clear what exactly happens, but generally we say women have an earlier chronotype than men, so they want to go to bed earlier than men. And that is true until menopause, and then there's a shift, and that is either that women become later or men maybe become somewhat earlier. But it seems like that then sort of sexes meet in sort of sleep times.
So do you think there's a hormonal influence there? Because obviously, you know, the shift in, you know, relative amounts of testosterone versus estrogen versus testosterone. Obviously, during the menopause, there is a shift in that kind of percentage and those ratios. Do you think there's something related there to well, obviously there is a hormonal relationship to all of this, but do you think that's related to hormonal shifts?
Probably could play a role. I don't think it's the only reason why that happens, but we know that there are estrogen receptors in the brain and also in the clock area, and we know that there is interplay between sleep and hormones, as well as the circadian system and ovarian hormones. So absolutely, that will play a role here. But it's also aging, right? As part of normal aging, sleep changes, and so does our timing system change. There are changes to that body clock that I was describing, which sits up there in the brain. There are changes to that just as part of normal aging, as you know, as many other things change as well, and that will have consequences. So
my understanding is that, you know, young children, you know, infants and babies, they require a lot more sleep, and then progressively it's less and less sleep, isn't it, until you're almost a full-grown adult. Does it then reverse? So obviously, as you get, you know, past a certain age, do you then need more sleep, or do you need less sleep? Does it just stay kind of in that ballpark of that 7 to 9 that we're always kind of thrown at us?
Yeah, it's a good question, and we're not entirely sure. So what we see, exactly what you said, you know, little children or babies and little children, they need a lot of sleep. Teenagers still need somewhere 9 to 10 hours. And then adults, yeah, somewhere between 7 and 9. And then as we age, it might be just an hour less. So let's say if you used to have, I don't know, 8.5, it might be 7.5. But it's not entirely sure, but it wouldn't be more. It wouldn't be that we suddenly need more sleep when we're older. That would probably more be related to, you know, any kind of illness or disease, particularly something like neurodegenerative diseases.
And I guess that ties in with also physical activity, right? So if you know, if the average is 7 to 9 hours, for example, if you've got somebody who gets great sleep, great depth of sleep, and, you know, recovers well off 7, if they start to exercise more or train more or put more demands on the body physically or cognitively, I'm guessing sleep goes up, right?
Yeah, it could absolutely have an impact on the sleep, whether that is forever or whether that is when it's an adjustment period, because there's more physical activity, and then it might swing back. But absolutely, you know, there is something in this, you know, the more you use the brain and the body, the more recovery is needed.
Yeah, it's very clever. It's so there's variability. We've ascertained this. There's huge amounts of variability, right? But there are certain things that we know are kind of, they're a given. Science reinforces them. We know that this pattern kind of occurs. This circadian pattern that we know occurs in kind of that sequence. And this is, you know, we talked about a week or so ago, didn't we? And we mentioned about did you have a look at the studies with the East to West Coast?
I've looked at some. Remind me again which one we talked about.
So I'd mentioned about the betting. It was actually brought about by betting against sport in America, where the transition for East to West Coast. So obviously one team is out of rhythm with their circadian, you know, cycles, and obviously the way, I assume, in which they train, right? So, you know, if you have a weight session or whatever, you know, American football or whatever, you might have a coaching session in the morning, then you might do your weights in the afternoon, then you might do cardio in the evening, and there's a pattern formed, right? And then obviously you get used to performing at that particular time. It's kind of what elite athletes do with acclimatization, right? Is that if you're used to performing at your maximal intensity at 4 p.m. in the afternoon, then you shift to somewhere where they're asking you to perform at your maximal intensity at 7 a.m., but you've always done it at 4 p.m., there's going to be a drop in performance. So obviously there's a couple of studies and a bit of data around this east to west coast phenomenon where they were actually predicting, and obviously that came down to gambling, and they were predicting the results of games based off circadian biology, which was fascinating. And I was, and when you find that kind of data, people then start to think about it in a more, reinforced way, I think, because then people go, okay, so there's something here, because obviously clearly people are analyzing and betting on this. So therefore it adds weight to the data almost, in that people are going, well, hold on, so I can win money if I bet on the non-biologically synced team. It's fascinating. So there's kind of those bits and pieces out there about it. And obviously we know from a sporting performance perspective that this does affect sports performance quite significantly. Is that a field that you've ever delved into?
No, I wouldn't say that specifically with, performance athletes, but it comes back to your chronotype, the time setting within your body. The people who are earlies, who wake up early, their performance peak is also somewhat in the first part of the day, mentally as well as physically. Whereas for someone, who's a late type, that's all shifted by maybe 2 or 3 hours. And so if I train when physically my body, is kind of set up to do this, I'm going to be, really good at what I'm doing. When I then, just like you said, when suddenly, there's this time shift and my inner body clock becomes out of sync with the environmental time, the environmental like dark cycle, then that will have a negative impact on my performance. And that's a real big question when it comes to performance athletes. And it's not yet fully understood. But what some research is suggesting, that amongst performance athletes, actually there is an overrepresentation of morning people versus evening people. And that might have something to do with typically when training takes place, and also when the competition, when that takes place, the runs, and like I say, it's more research is needed. But I think at the moment the advice is train when it's good for you.
Yeah.
I do most of your training there to really improve on your performance, but then also train at times, when it's likely that you have to compete, so that your body sort of gets used to also performing at other, less advantageous times.
Yeah, it's interesting. I recall reading, I think it was Malcolm Gladwell. He wrote some stuff about hockey players when he was talking about the 10,000 hours of practice. And there was some interesting data with respect to the NHL, the ice hockey league in the US, in that the vast majority of players were all born within 3 months of each other, because they start hockey at a very young age. And obviously these teams, they have these incredible academies that look after these players from a very young age. And what they do is they pick all the biggest players. And the biggest players were always the oldest people in that year group. And obviously when you're very young, it's very much defined by age. It's, the older kids are always bigger. And then when you get to 15 and 16, people start catching up and overtaking each other, and it kind of becomes irrelevant. But it was interesting that all of the players were in this 3-month birth date. So they all celebrate their birthdays around a similar time, but all the professional players that had made it through the academy ranks had been in those things. So it's quite interesting to think that there's genetics, and there's everything that you take on board with sports. And if you want to play basketball, it's not good if you're 5'2", and there's all of these factors. And now we've all of a sudden got this other one, which is you might actually be influenced by your chronotype. Will dictate whether you're going to perform in a particular sport based on, I guess, when that sport actually performs. I mean, take soccer. It's soccer once upon a time was only ever played on a Saturday afternoon. Whereas now they play in the evenings, they play in the mornings, and And I guess there's so many factors there, and obviously European and international football where teams are traveling across time zones a lot, right? So I guess a lot of the predictability that was probably existed when a sport was only ever played on one particular day. You know, American football used to play pretty much on a Sunday, wasn't it? And it was, you know, it's fascinating as you bring all those sort of fields together and start to look at them and go, wow, there's patterns here that we can see. And the chronotype one really interests me in that, you know, I'm pretty adamant I'm probably a morning person, but I'm not entirely sure now. I'm deliberating. I remember as a kid I was very difficult to get out of bed, but I think that's, you know, it's being a kid, right?
Exactly right. Like, and as I said, it can change, right? So it depends what age that was. You know, it changes, and the different factors. Your genes are certainly one factor, and your sex is another. But your light exposure, so when the lights go on and when the lights go off, and how regular these times are, that can influence us. There's an influence of our food intake, or the eating patterns, the timing of that can impact also the circadian system, not necessarily the clock up in the brain, but the tissue clocks, for example, the clock in the liver, right? That's more responsive to sort of food intake and rhythms there. So there is a lot that's going on. And then social norms, they can also impact. So there is a lot, and it's probably all sort of, you know, bidirectional. It's not just one direction, that goes in lots of different directions.
So light, let's hone in on light a little bit, because this is an interesting one, because obviously now, you know, we're in November. I think we've lost, what is it, ballpark? It's about, we've nearly lost 2 hours of sunlight, and up until the clock's going back, obviously, we'd lost about 2 hours of sunlight, and we've fairly quickly, I think within about a month, you know, the sun used to come up at about 6 a.m. and then all of a sudden it was 7:30 and 8, and now it's gone back a little bit. And we talked briefly about the shifts when we had the call the other week, and it was, how does that light and that change of times and things affect? And again, there's a lot of data, isn't there, with respect to you know, countries that don't get a lot of light exposure and certain conditions and depression, anxiety, etc., and different ways different nations deal with that. I know there's some really interesting stuff in Finland and various other places where they have actually terms for the way they keep themselves happy and keep themselves content and blah blah blah. So how is light the big thing that we talk about, and is it a major influencer in this whole thing? And we talk zeitgebers, you know, time givers and these things. So how does light play a role here?
So light is, you know, maybe the most important thing for our body clock. So I said the sort of the body clock, or the master clock, or central clock, there's different words for it, sits up in the brain, and it sets the rhythm for everything else that happens in the body. Now, this clock also needs to be in synchrony with our outside world, right? So that it tells the body to do the right thing at the right time. There's no use of us running around in the middle of the night and trying to catch some prey, when actually our night vision is pretty poor, and, you know, a big cat like a lion and so on and so forth can easily come and eat us up, or rather not us, our ancestors, who presumably evolved on the African savannah. So what is happening is that in our eyes we have a special photoreceptor system that is just for light detection, not for vision. It simply detects light. And when that detects light, and it is most sensitive to blue light, it's like the strongest signal it can get. When it detects light, it passes that message back to the clock up there in the brain. And then that clock knows, it's daytime. And so then it will send a message to the rest of the body, it's daytime. And then all the other clocks within the body and all the other tissues and organs, they know what to do. And then when the eyes suddenly see darkness, because that's also, you know, information, when they see darkness, they pass that to the clock. And then the clock's, okay, body, now it's nighttime. And that's, by the way, when melatonin sort of springs into action. And I guess lots of listeners will have heard of melatonin. It's basically a hormone that's under the sort of the control of the clock, and that signals the rest of the body, nighttime, it's on its way. It's not a sedative, it's not a sleepiness hormone or something like that. It very much tells the rest of the body, hey, nighttime, it's on its way. It has a bit of a sleep promoting effect. but that's not really its job. Right? So coming back to the light, so this light is immensely important to let our body clock know day has started, right? And equally, we want the darkness because that signals the night. And so in an ideal scenario, and that is what, you know, our ancestors had, and we have unfortunately lost, is we would spend most of our waking day outside in the natural daylight. And then when the sun goes down, you know, that is the signal, okay, now it's nighttime. The problem we have now in modern living is that we have electric lighting. And so we can manipulate the light environment around us. And while the light levels generally indoors are much, much lower than outside, even an overcast day, it is still brighter outside than it is indoors. And that sort of means for most of the day, the clock doesn't really know, what should I be saying? In the evening, the light is then unfortunately strong enough to suggest to our body clock, hey, it's still daytime. Which is why the clock will very much for most of the evening, as long as the light's on, tell the body daytime, 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 daytime. Now, what we can then do, we with a, you know, snips our finger, we turn the light off in a millisecond. But for our body clock, you know, our biological system, it takes much longer to get that message and then to relate it to the body, which is one reason probably why some people having problems falling asleep or their sleep quality is reduced, because it's just this messaging comes too late or is too weak in some way or another.
Yeah, I was just about to mention that because obviously, you know, during the course of a day, it might be. I was thinking we have a courtroom out in the hallway, and it's pitch black inside of it. So if I was to go in there in the middle of the day and shut the door and it's dark, my brain doesn't all of a sudden go, it's ready to sleep. And it's the same with light, isn't it? Light, we need a certain amount of it. And you mentioned about, you know, I have it's usually sat on, it might actually be in my bag there. I have a light meter, a proper industrial light meter that I can check the lighting, but I have an app on my phone which does a pretty good job, to be fair. They're fairly close to each other. But the light in my office is about 800 lux at best. And I have a whopping great window in front of me that shines light through it. But I know if I walk outside, that number just multiplies infinitely. It goes crazy. And then obviously in the winter months, I actually have an SAD light there that goes on in the morning, because in the winter months I get up at a time when it's dark. So it doesn't really work for me. So there's a certain amount of light, isn't there, that we need? And there's also a certain amount of darkness that we need. And we need to have that for a significant amount of time before your brain starts to register and then clock and do these things, which is, I think, what you alluded to there. And we talked about blue light. And just for clarity, blue light, because there's such an association now with blue light and devices. People, when we refer to blue light, people always think screens, you know, phones and devices. But when we're referring to blue light, what are we actually referring to? What is blue light and what is the difference?
So good question. So the light that we see, that white light, is made up of different colors, right? Different sort of of different colors. And there is blue light in there. There's red light. There's green light. You know, there's more purple. All these different colors are in there. For us, it all seems white. But that special photoreceptor in our eyes, that's particularly sensitive to the blue light, right? And that's naturally in the daylight, and the content of that blue light varies across the day. And that in itself also provides our clock with information, right? This change in that spectral contribution that's happened. And again, that the clock will use that as a signal of, okay, we're changing the colors in the light. That means, you know, nighttime is on its way. The devices that we use, phone, laptop, you know, all these screen devices, they're also made up of different wavelengths of light. For us, just visible as white light, but it's got these different colors. And there is a lot of blue light in them. And so that this blue light keeps stimulating that photoreceptor in the eyes, and therefore the body clock. And not only is there a lot of blue in them, typically we hold the phone very close to our face, right? So all that light that's coming off that phone screen goes in. Laptop, tablet, similar. TV, I'd say, is different. It's the same LED screen, but it's much further away.
Yeah.
Right? So typically when clients say, oh, is it okay to watch TV in the evening? I say, yeah, as long as you have a little side lamp on, right, which will also help to diffuse the light coming from the screen. That's all interacting. Another thing that I learned quite painfully during my PhD, that all interacts. I'm less worried about, right? I just on a side note, I would say there, you know, just turn the TV off maybe half an hour before. Again, there's no fixed sort of cutoff time. It depends on the person. And be, of course, mindful what you're watching. You know, some people get more sort of stimulated, as in the brain gets more stimulated by certain shows, news, or movies than others. Just be a bit mindful, but on a whole, I'm less worried about the TV than I am of the phone or something like a tablet that's right in front of you.
Yeah, this is something that I've kind of referred to quite a bit, is sort of the topics, right? Is that the topic of TV and what you're watching, and is it stimulating, and blah, blah, blah. And I went through this phase probably about 10 years ago where, you know, I got into this whole, oh, you've got to read before you go to bed. The problem is that, and again, if you take a look at my bookshelf, that there's nothing there that wouldn't be stimulating. So the problem is that I read facts. I don't read fiction. I don't read things that are kind of calming or anything like this. I read stuff that ultimately I put the book down and then I think repeatedly for a long time afterwards. So what was happening is I was putting the book down and then lying in bed, just unable to sleep for a large period of time because I'd stimulated my brain so much. So I had to actually step away from reading at night because it was causing me problems. And I reverted back to a habit of when I was a kid, was to watch TV before I go to bed, which felt alien. It felt wrong. It felt like I wasn't following the, you know, the social media representation of what, you know, performance should be, and everybody should read, and you should go to bed and you should read and you should journal and do all these different things. And I was thinking, well, you know, why is this not working for me? But the TV calms me. It gives me something almost fairly mind numbing that prevents me overthinking. If I lie down in a dark room, my brain goes crazy. It's like, yeah, absolutely. Right. So it was, and it's that variability, I think, between people, isn't it? That that you're trying to manage. And it was interesting to hear you say that, look, you have people who say, is it okay to watch TV? And obviously there's various things that you can put in place there that make it it's perfectly okay, provided you do this. And what about, so we hear a lot now about blue light blocking. The devices have little things on that you can swipe across and put onto the screens. The data I've read on that's not very convincing. They seem to be pretty poor, these screen diffusers almost that are built in. But we hear a lot about blue light blocking glasses, and you know, there's yellow ones, there's different lights that they block out. But how effective are these? Are these a suitable thing for people to have if they have to be on screens until later in the evening?
Yeah, that's a good point. They have to be, right. There are studies that do show that wearing blue blockers or blue blocking glasses in the evening can be helpful. I would suggest, you know, if you have to, then reduce the blue light content on your screen for what it's worth. If you can, reduce the brightness, so that it still feels comfortable, and have those blue light blocking glasses on. The other point for me, though, there is, you know, if you have to,
excuse me,
if you have to, because often the phone, in particular the phone, is just a way of passing time. We're just bored. And how often, you know, do we sit and watch a movie or a show on TV and you've got your phone out at the same time?
Having a coughing fit there. I'm back with you, I think. I've got a terribly bad throat at the moment.
I use that to cough as well then, because I had it early on. It was like, oh.
It's like sneezing as soon as one person starts and yawning.
Yeah, then the others. No.
I think I've got tears in my eye here. I'm trying to prevent myself from coughing here. It's one of those nasty tickly coughs. It just sits there and anyways, I carry on. I turned the volume down. I thought I'll carry on here. And
okay, I wasn't sure. That's why I stopped. blue blocking glasses, right? That's
Yes.
what we're talking about. Yeah. So I want to come back to the have to, right? For sure, some people have to, check emails late, or maybe work late because they're on a case, or they work in an international company, and so on and so forth. But there's also many of us where looking at the phone is just a way of passing time. There is, in that sense, actually no pressing need. It's just become a habit.
Yeah.
It's kind of thing that we do because out of boredom. But then there's also, of course, the fear of missing out. So there's a lot of psychological things happening here. But what I work on with my clients is to not necessarily say you cannot look at your phone after 9 p.m. because that's just, again, an arbitrary rule. And that's not necessarily going to fix a poor sleep. But what we work on, first of all, is just to notice that the urge to pick up that phone and look at it, and then do a quick assessment. Do I really have to? Or is it because I'm bored or whatever, I'm feeling a bit low and want to distract myself from that feeling?
Yeah.
So it's just to become a bit more mindful of what's going on in their body and why, and then making a decision, right? And sometimes that will be, yep, I'm feeling a bit bored. Yeah, I'm aware of what blue light does or could potentially do. I am still choosing to pick up the phone now. But another night they might say, no, actually, I don't. Right. So that's another thing. It's really this, do I really have to? For some people, yes, it will. And then the blue blocking glass is great. But for others, actually, it isn't necessary.
It's almost, you're tapping very much into behavioral psychology there, right? And you're starting to get into, the reason why people do things, and contextual cues, and all these things that ingrain with habits that we do and things that we do, and almost rationalizing why we do them. It's like people who have a drink of an evening. Quite often it's just a matter of turning around and saying, well, what's the purpose behind it and why do you do it? Yeah. And I always go back on nutrition, where people would almost ban, they'd say, look, you're not allowed something. And it's, they classify it as kind of the white elephant scenario, where you're told not to think about something, so you do. So you give them this arbitrary rule of turning your phone off at 9 p.m. Then there's a level of anxiety that raises because they actually want to be on their phone, right? Yeah. So it almost becomes counterproductive, right?
Yeah, exactly. And also the other thing is, then they do it, and then it's like, right, I followed the rule, surely I'll fall asleep now. And then they wait.
And there's added anxiety around.
Exactly. So that's why I, avoid rules as much as I can. I work on healthy habits, which you can adapt, which, absolutely depending on what's going on in your life, rather than these very strict instructions and rule settings.
And you wanting to relax people, right? And there's nothing less relaxing than a set of rules that you've got to abide by.
Yeah, exactly.
Boxes you've got to tick. You almost want everything to be kind of like, really, relaxed and natural and normal. And there's quite a lot of, which is encouraging. You read a lot about sleep now. And whenever we've talked to sleep experts or people in the sleep field, there's an awful lot of emphasis away from the time that you sleep. There's a lot of emphasis on the rest of the day. The last sleep expert we talked about, that we spent the entire podcast talking about the morning, and then we talked about light exposure and all the things that we've been talking about. And it's nice to see that there's this relaxed output with respect to sleep. Whereas once upon a time it was go to bed, turn off the lights and fall asleep. Whereas now there's, look, if you're not tired and you don't feel sleepy, don't go to bed, because you're going to lie in bed and probably think about the fact you should be sleeping. And we've all been there. I mean, I remember, many years ago, I used to lay in bed quite often at night and think, I've got to sleep. And you kind of forcing your eyes shut and trying to do, and it becomes counterintuitive, and fundamentally it never works, right? It never works. So when you're looking at people, because obviously sleep is your speciality that came out the back of this, and I'd like to say it isn't really sleep. It's kind of day management, isn't it? It's management of everything. It just so happens that the culminating factor at the end of this is an improvement in people's sleep, right? So when we talk about sleep, sleep's kind of this, again, it's an arbitrary number, right? People say you need 7 to 9 hours sleep, but obviously we've got sleep varies, right? Sleep is this massive You know, we've got different stages, we've got different types of sleep that manage different things. We've got true recovery. And I guess when we're talking about sleep, we're talking about recovery, right? We're talking about how well can someone recover from, you know, consolidate memories, you know, recover physically, you know, do all the things that they need to do when they sleep. And again, there's this big mystery, isn't there, over sleep still, is that we're not entirely sure why we need it.
Exactly.
It's remarkable, isn't it? So it's like this, you know, and you dig into it, and you're like, nobody actually really knows. It's still this huge mystery as to why, but we need it. We've ascertained we need it. So when we talk about sleep, what are we talking about? Are we talking about, so if I was to have 7 to 9 hours sleep, and this is just me with my eyes shut, me in some stage of sleep, doesn't matter which stage it is that adequate, or do I need to be hitting a certain, and again, we've got devices now, you know, I'm wearing 2 devices, and I'm sure you've got devices, and everybody's got devices, and everybody's looking at the quality of their sleep. So what are we actually looking for when it comes to sleep? What are we looking for optimal recovery? What are we looking for depth of sleep, rapid eye movement? Where are we looking at here?
We're looking at a lot. Comes back to the variability that you mentioned a couple of times before. And in the same way that we see, you know, that spectrum of chronotypes, we see, you know, that people vary in how much sleep they need, and by the way, again, sort of timing, right? So that sort of goes, they go hand in hand there. So there is no fixed amount that's right for everyone. And even that amount changes over the course of the life, as we talked about early on. The best way to find out, you know, is the sleep that I'm getting, is that right for me? The duration, the timing, and sort of related to that, the quality. Is that right for me? Is to look at when you wake up, how do I feel? Right? That's in the way the best thing. And for that, you don't need a device. You just need to be able to objectively listen and pay attention to yourself and how you feel, right? That's the key thing. And again, that is something I help my clients to, not necessarily develop. It's kind of probably just rediscover, right? Because that's there, that sleep sense. So they just have to rediscover that. Now, for many of us, it's fair to say that, again, because of the society we live in, social expectations and commitments and so on and so forth, we probably do not get the duration of sleep that we need, or we're probably not sleeping at the right time. What we see, certainly pre-pandemic, was that vast amounts of the population would get an hour or sometimes even 2 hours less a night during the working week, and then, you know, sleep in a different way, as in different duration, slightly different times on the weekend. And that takes its toll on the system, on our health, physical as well as mental health. So the key really is to find out, well, what is my personal sleep window? And there's an easy way to do that, is to take 5 days holiday, not leave the UK, so stay in the same time zone, not go out drinking, partying, and also being mindful with blue light emitting devices in the evening, and then just go to bed as and when you feel sleepy, and get up when you wake up. And because, as I said, most of us, we carry this sleep debt, we need to repay that in some way. And that's probably what we do typically over maybe 4 or 5 nights, which is why, you know, on that 5th day, you then would know, okay, these are my sleep times, this is the sleep durations that I need in order to feel refreshed. Okay. And then it's just about, wherever you can, organizing your day that you are, you know, in bed at that time and for that duration. Won't happen every night, because life's life, you know, work, if children could get ill, you get ill, you know, you travel, so there naturally will be some disruption. But that's okay, as long as these things remain outliers and we get into this rhythm, right?
Okay, so a big question we always get asked is about shift work, and obviously there's pretty scary and quite daunting data when it comes to shift work, and obviously illnesses, cancers, and various other things, and obviously the problematic scenario that shift work puts us into. And we always used to contend this from a nutritional standpoint, is people were always, look, I work shifts, when should I eat? And the answer was often, you know, we go back and the answer would just be, look, when you wake up, have your breakfast and just follow suit for the rest of the day and just treat the day like it would be normally. And you know, it's all you've done is just shift everything. If you get up at 2 a.m. in the morning, you eat your breakfast at 2 a.m. in the morning, then you have your lunch 3 to 4 hours later, and then you et cetera, and you just follow a normal pattern. And then that often seems to be kind of the best solution to it. Now, if you've got people on shift work who are switching from ultimately time zone to time zone, right, on a, you know, bi-weekly basis or whatever it might be, what's the best way of managing that? Is that a matter of, you know, using technology to our advantage and saying, right, what we're going to do is we're actually going to expose ourselves to, you know, maybe using a light device? Are we going to expose ourselves to light? And obviously when it comes to our theoretical bedtime, which might be the middle of the day for some people, do we then simulate the darkness? Do we start to, you know, close blinds, and do we get some blackout blinds and things like this, and actually start to simulate this environment where it's nighttime theoretically? You know, how do people manage that, or do you have suggestions as to how people go about that?
It's really tricky. So I worked for quite some time with shift workers from safety critical industries. So, you know, anywhere there's a 24/7 operation, and if someone falls asleep, that will cause a massive incident. So there could be, you know, pilots, flight attendants, miners, gas rig workers, all of that. And they work all kinds of shift patterns. And in particular, I would say aviation is even, they're not necessarily worse, but there's even less regularity, because for most shift workers, they know I'm working X many days night shift, and then, you know, day shifts or whichever rotation. But it is fundamentally hard to prepare for that, because you have these constant changes, right, that are happening. And our biology is set up in the way that we are awake when there's light, and we're asleep when it's dark. And everything in our body, not just the wake and the sleeping, but every process in our body is set up for this. So the liver, the stomach, the heart, they will work the hardest, right? They are expecting food to come in the light phase. And then when it goes dark, they expect no more food to be coming. So hormones don't need to be released. Enzymes don't need to be at the ready, because there shouldn't be any food to digest. What happens for someone who changes from a night shift onto a day shift, which happens within, you know, something 24 hours, the biology can't turn itself on its head that quickly. And so what then happens, while we can choose when to eat and when not to eat, that's under our control. So I can, in that sense, change my eating times, but my physiology actually hasn't flipped, right? So suddenly I decided 12 midnight to have a little snack, to kind of, because my alertness is slowly dipping. So, you know, maybe I have a coffee or I have an energy bar or something that goes into the stomach, but the stomach isn't prepared for that. And suddenly that's there. And so then it's almost like the stomach has to wake up and do something with this. But the pancreas, you know, further down the line hasn't got that message. Takes even longer for the pancreas to get the message, hey, actually, you know, there's now some food and you need to do something. So what that leads to basically is an inner disruption of the different processes, of the different tissues and organs within our body. And that then, you know, sets the scene for metabolic diseases, diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular diseases. So coming back to your question, how do you manage this? It's intrinsically hard, and it's well recognized that shift workers have a high rate of metabolic diseases, right, because of these constant disruptions. Now, what I would say to someone who is going onto a night shift, a swing of nights, is when it comes to eating, eat at the start of your night shift. So that could be, you know, early evening, late afternoon, depending when it is. That is your main meal. And then throughout your shift, if at all, have healthy light snacks. If you want to consume caffeine, you know, do so maybe in the first part of your night shift, but then cut that caffeine out. Sure, stay hydrated. And then when you get home, it's probably better to have a light breakfast. And it's really interesting. Some shift workers, I remember saying, you know, I come home and I go to bed straight away. If I don't do that, I won't fall asleep. Others have said, oh, I stay awake a little bit and then I go and find it easier to fall asleep. Again, there's no one size fits all strategy. But what are typically saying is it's hard to sleep during the day, even if you have blackout blinds, even if you have earplugs in, because there is just the natural disruption. There's only so much you can control. I remember on one mine site that I was at, there were so many people who complained about their neighbors lowering their lawn. And I thought, wow, I mean, that grass needs to be super short now, because I've heard the story so many times, but that's completely out of their control, right? That's just environmental factors, all sort of, you know, and then you have that inbuilt rhythm of being awake when there is light, and sleep when it's dark.
Yeah, no, and that kind of brings us on to, well, it kind of brings us into another topic, which is an interesting one that kind of ties in with all of this, and that is the the popularity, I guess, of diet and nutritional methodology around fasting. And obviously fasting is something that it's very popular. There's some great data behind it, and there's obviously a lot of correlations in with what we're talking about here with respect to shift works, because obviously if somebody fasts for periods of times, all of a sudden you can actually manage your days feasibly better, because if you're only eating once or twice a day, during a fasting regime, or you've got these big blocks of time where you actually don't need to eat, it then all of a sudden becomes quite easy to manage, right? Whereas when you're trying to eat 4 meals a day, on these alternating shift patterns, it all of a sudden becomes quite complex. It becomes quite complicated. And that was I always remember that was the challenge that we had. It was always, well, I've got to eat X amount of calories and I've got to eat X amount of times a day, but I sleep between the hours of, maybe 6 p.m. and 1 a.m. in the morning, and I get home and I sleep during those sort of strange hours or peculiar hours, and then it was this kind of trying to jam it all in. So it's quite interesting. And do you know much? Obviously, it's a very different field, I guess, the nutritional stuff. But do you pick up much on the fasting sort of data or fasting trend that's kind of very popular at the moment?
Yeah. So fasting, for me, from a circadian perspective, what's interesting is time restricted eating or time restricted feeding if it's for animals, and what's coming through more and more, it's not just what we eat, it's the when, right? The timing, and again the regularity. And in the way that I was talking about that sleep window, we also want to have a regular eating window. And ideally that eating window sits with our wake period when there is daylight outside, because in evolutionary terms, again, that's what our ancestors would have done, right? They would have eaten while it's light, and they, would have been fasting when it's dark, which is why kind of it has evolved that the stomach is active, is ready for food in the day, and then, slows down. And what research is showing there for that eating window, that it seems to be beneficial to keep that eating window to less than 12 hours. Maybe 11, 10, some people manage to do 8. I don't quite know how, but they can. And keeping it certainly to less than 12 within sort of the light phase, that has beneficial impacts on our metabolic health, and related to that then also on our sleep, but also for our mental health. And for those people who want to lose weight, what some data is suggesting is that we have our dinner early evening, maybe in the afternoon, and have our dinner then. That can help losing weight. That doesn't mean we have to restrict our calories, just that eating window that is much shorter, and it ends way before we go to bed. So I find quite interesting, and that is certainly something that comes up in conversation with clients.
Yeah, there's always interesting stuff coming out with respect to nutrition, but fasting and time restricted eating are, however different people term it, and people have different rules around it, but fundamentally we're still trying to achieve the same physiological outcome at the end of it. Is a really interesting field, and something that I'm sure we'll dig into in further podcasts with other people who are in those areas a little bit more. But so other things, I guess it's, your experience in that field is, is vast, and obviously being in that field, what's out there that's exciting right now? What's emerging, what's coming through, what are we finding out now that's kind of fresh or new, or what do we know about, because obviously we're going back, and again, the fasting thing is obviously, a lot of mammals, they eat once a day, or they graze, or they, and there's all these different patterns that different mammals have, but ultimately we're talking about mammalian biology here, right? So, which, you started with the meerkats, which was, everybody's getting up, and all the people around me are quite chipper now because everybody's, everybody's getting up at the right time they should be. So what are the emerging things? What are the exciting things? What, where are we going with circadian biology? Is it going to be something that there's going to be more and more research in? Is there going to be, a lot of exciting data come in? Is there going to be, where's it going? What's, what can we expect from it all?
Yeah, I think a lot more. That sort of term circadian health, I think, will become bigger. And one is around nutrition and that eating window, and that, personalizing that. And as well as the eating window is what you eat. There's different people who react to the same type of food in different ways. So I guess that's really interesting. But then there's also, when we administer certain medication or certain treatments, that again, there is data showing, I don't know, I can't exactly remember, but chemotherapy may work better at certain times of the internal, as in your internal time, than at other internal times, right? So that can have huge implications, as I say, for treatments, for medication, maybe even surgery, who knows? So that will be much better understood. And then also, I think how our circadian timing system works, I think that will also be better understood. At the moment, the view is that it's very hierarchical, which is what I outlined. We've got that clock up in the brain. It's like the master or central clock, and that tells everyone else, every other clock, what to do or coordinates them. But it's very much a top-down. What I think seeing more and more is actually that there's a feedback loop, and that these clocks in the peripheral, right, in the organs, they can also respond to other time cues. Like I said, for example, the eating or scheduled exercise, right? That can, if you've got regularly scheduled exercise, that can entrain your lung on a slightly different rhythm, and so on and so forth. And I think the better we understand all of that, and the better recommendations we can then give to shift workers, to come back to one of your questions, we can then give to shift workers to help them adapt better or quicker, right? To reduce the risk of diseases there.
Fascinating. I mean, it is such an emerging field, and there's, as we both know, that when it comes to research is new when it's 20 years old, and it's and then it starts to emerge, and I think the field of circadian biology, and certainly with respect to humans, because years ago it was all very much done on insects and small creatures, and we're now actually observing it. And I think that there is so much more data available, right? Is that these devices and things like this, are these useful tools for people to be utilizing? We chatted briefly about it, about the obsessive tendency that people have with devices, that all of a sudden they're being led by some digital algorithm rather than necessarily what they, and you referenced, getting up in the morning and seeing how you feel. And I guess there's got to be a lot of self-awareness there, right? It's
yeah, exactly.
Somebody getting up in the morning and going, do you feel good? I think there's a lot of people don't actually know what good feels like.
Yeah.
And it's a building of that self-awareness. So how do you develop that in people? And obviously, how does that relate to, the previous question?
Mm-hmm. So I think devices have their time and place, and I think there's still a lot of sort of improvement to the technologies that will happen. And I would never sort of count them entirely, but for me, as I said, it's much more empowering the individual to better understand your body, right? Because then you can make better decisions all around. And it starts with, how do I feel when I wake up in the morning? But then also, across the day, how often do I reach for caffeine or the quick, sugar fix. What's my mood like? How does my mood change across the day, right? But looking at that with an objective, like a scientist mind, rather than subjectively, oh, this is all bad, oh God, my mood had just dropped, oh my God, I have the second piece of chocolate, oh, this is bad, this is all horrible. Right? We want to do that objectively, collect that data. How do we do that? I think one is to empower clients with an understanding, of how things work, how sleep works, circadian rhythms, how things just, the rhythm of alertness, for example, that changes across the 24-hour clock. It starts to rise in the morning with or without coffee. It just does, it rises, but then it has a dip around lunchtime, and then it rises again and has its peak just before you go to bed, and then it flips and it goes down, right? So just learning to observe that. And for me, the way I go about, apart from helping my clients understand, is also is basic mindfulness skills, to stop, almost press the pause button and just check in. What am I feeling inside my body, right? Emotionally, physically, mentally, what's going on? And just do that, throughout the day, just for a few seconds, just sort of starting to build up that knowledge by just pressing the pause button. And I think the added benefit that, by the way, has, given, we live in this fast-paced world where we do lots of work simultaneously, and it's always the next. Having this moment of pause, just helps to slow everything down, lower cortisol, lowering adrenaline, giving the brain maybe a moment to just catch up with itself before we then speed up again. And that can have a positive impact on the nighttime sleep. So it comes back to something that you said earlier on. You spoke in an episode with a sleep specialist, actually it's the daytime that matters. It absolutely is. And I think having these moments of pausing are super essential.
And that's just almost like a reset. And I was reading a piece about all these, the big kind of blue chip companies, and Google and YouTube offices and blah blah blah, all reinforcing this biphasic sleep pattern, almost, where they were saying, look, we want to give our employees this opportunity to rest at this point where we get this natural sort of circadian biological slump later in the afternoon, where people are saying, look, take a moment, take 15 minutes, go and take a walk outside, get some sunlight, whatever it might be, or ideal scenario is it ideal? That's probably my question to you. Is it ideal to have a nap at that point? And again, there's these time limitations on naps where we don't want to get into too deep sleep, but we also don't want to just kind of rest our eyes, or do we? What would be, and biphasic and polyphasic sleep is obviously, this is all more stuff that's emerging. But again, we've got to put it into a practical scenario.
Yeah,
I'm a big fan of all of this stuff, but really, when we put it into a practical application, it's not, for the majority of people, having a sleep in the afternoon just isn't feasible. But where do you sit with that? Is that an optimal thing to do? Is that a good thing to do if opportunity arises? Is it, where do you sit with that?
Depends on the person. So someone who's a normal good sleeper, who wakes up feeling refreshed, if that person wants to have an afternoon nap, sort of early afternoon, maybe sort of 1, 2 o'clock, certainly not later than 3, for 20 minutes, half an hour, absolutely fine, right? Because that shouldn't have an impact on their nighttime sleep. If you're someone who suffers from insomnia or another sleep problem where the quality or the quantity of your sleep at night is reduced, then the danger is that this nap can become a way of substituting for the poor sleep at night. And there I would say, no, let's not have that. Let's work on, improving that nighttime sleep. But for those, who sleep fine and who can nap, so my dad is a napper, I'm a non-napper. I can sit down, I can close my eyes, but typically I don't fall asleep. Whereas my dad does his 20 minutes and then boom, he's full of energy again. So people vary between that. But I think from a sort of practical point of view, to come back to that, I think that's really important. I think it is important to recognize that there is a dip in alertness in the early afternoon. right? And to slow down. It's a signal again that our body is sending us. And I have got a choice here. I can push against this biological signal and in a way biological need for slowing down, and that will come at a cost, or I can just go with it and use it as a way of recharging. There's lots of studies that have shown that taking breaks boosts your energy levels and your work engagement and therefore productivity, and naps very much so. They also boost, memory consolidation, so you get that effect there as well. So I think it's hugely important to take that moment of slowing down.
Yeah, I remember used to do some corporate wellness stuff probably 15 or 20 years ago. We used to refer to a lot of the stuff that was coming out of Japan at the time, which was, about, they would start their day on the rooftops of these big buildings. And the first thing that would happen is they'd expose themselves to huge amounts of light, which maybe at that point, I don't recall it ever being referenced as that was one of the goals. It was just kind of a default happening. It's a bit like people who walk their dog and they all of a sudden I feel really good in the morning because I walk my dog. And then you've got exercise, probably one of the strongest zeitgebers or time givers that we can have, right, with circadian, rhythmicity. And then we've got movement and we've got light, and we're tying them both in together. And this is what they used to do. They used to take all their employees first thing in the morning, whether they'd walk to work or whatever it might be, and they used to make them do these, aerobics classes almost on the rooftop of these buildings. And it was this acknowledgement of, rather than trying to, drive ourselves into the ground, which I think a lot of people do themselves now, whereas, corporates still do it to employees. But I think a lot of people do that to themselves now because there's this whole, this hustle mentality and this mentality of, I read a thing just the other week of a celebrity who'd been harping on about, the hustle and the grind, they called it. And he was getting up at 2 a.m. in the morning and starting his day at 2 a.m. in the morning. But then it showed you his schedule, but he went to bed at 7. And it was just this whole, so people were going, oh, he's a harder worker than everybody else. And you just look at it and think, well, if he's got a reason to do it that way, that's fine. But he's just following the same pattern everybody else is. He's just decided to get up at 2 a.m. in the morning instead, which if it works for him and works with, hey, go ahead. But it was almost like it was painting this picture that he was doing something that nobody else was prepared to do. And it was just this complete shift. He's getting the same sleep everybody else is getting. He's just sort of moved his day around a little bit. And it was just this bizarre mentality. And I think there's this corporate thing, isn't there now, where, people don't want to give employees breaks. They don't want to let them recharge. They just think they can hammer them. And I think this is playing into the caffeine narrative, which is, we're a society that, coffee as an industry is unreal. The energy drink market is unreal. Obviously, we talk a lot about caffeine because we made a very, very concerted decision not to put caffeine into one of our products, which to the dismay of a lot of people, that the first question we always get is, why didn't you put caffeine in there? Which would go against our narrative, which is we're trying to educate more on caffeine and the use of caffeine, as opposed to necessarily demonizing it and saying caffeine's this awful thing that you shouldn't be using, when in fact the data and the research on caffeine, and particularly coffee as well, is fantastic. It's a wonderful supplement if used intelligently. So where is your stance on caffeine? Where are you a caffeine consumer?
Absolutely, and I had my coffee, this morning.
Absolutely.
But so caffeine again, it's been shown to boost our alertness, and I think to really get the maximum effects out of it, we should be, in that sense, limiting the intake and not drink it like water. Consume that caffeine when you need that alertness boost. Having said that, there's a caveat, because caffeine's half-life is very long. And so, caffeine consumed within 6 or 9 hours of our normal bedtime window could potentially impact sleep, and certainly anything that's consumed very closely to bedtime is likely to reduce the quality, but also it can shift the sleep onset. So when we fall asleep, can put that backwards. So having a cup of coffee, in the morning, absolutely fine. I wouldn't have it first thing, because your alertness naturally rises. So save it for maybe around lunchtime, when there is that slump. And one thing that we used to recommend, or it's general recommendation, particularly for lorry drivers, if they feel tired, is to say, okay, so pull over, have a cup of coffee, then sleep for 20 minutes, then go, for a quick walk around the lorry, and then continue driving, because the caffeine takes about 20 minutes to actually exert its effects, which you can use to sleep. And then once you get up, move around, so you've got the movement, you're outside, you get the light sort of alertness boost, and then, you've got sort of, in a way, a triple whammy. So I think, it's not to demonize it, it's just knowing how it works, when to use it, to your maximal advantage. That's the importance.
Yeah, and the comeback we often get, and I've got throughout my entire career of dealing with, high performance individuals, whether they're athletes or CEOs of businesses or whatever it might be, would be, but I have caffeine in the afternoon, and we're talking 3-4 o'clock typically here, and I sleep fine. And this is kind of goes back to our previous question about quality of sleep, because obviously people are still falling asleep, but what's happening is the depth of sleep and the quality of sleep that you're getting is actually being impacted. So on a surface level, they're going, well, I get my 7 to 9 hours, so there's no problem. So it's then convincing them that, hold on, but physiologically, that caffeine is still in your system, which means it is disrupted. It's a bit like the alcohol discussion, right? Is that alcohol, we know, detrimentally affects the quality of your sleep. It doesn't necessarily affect falling asleep or being able to fall asleep. It's just actually when you get into a sleep state, it's just not very good. It disrupts, and you actually, I think you actually wake up, don't you?
Yeah, so you do fall asleep maybe a bit quicker. It has sort of soporific effects on most people, not all. But then the second half of the night, it will disrupt your sleep much more. And in that sense, it deprives you particularly of the REM sleep, because first half of the night, you mentioned we have these different sleep stages. We have a lot of the deeper sleep, and in the second half of the night we have more of the REM sleep. REM sleep seems to be important for the emotional processing of our day-to-day experiences, and that is the stage that is frequently disrupted. And so there's some interesting sort of theories out there, this sort of hangover that we have after a night out, and the grumpiness that can come with that. Probably partially due to lack of sleep, but it may also partially be due to lack of that REM sleep, less processing of the emotional experiences. So it does a lot. But I want to come back to that caffeine and the example you just give. People said, oh, I consume it, late in the afternoon, and I still fall asleep. If you drill down, sometimes you do find out actually sleep isn't as good, but you need to ask a few more questions. But one important question to ask is, how do you feel when you wake up? How do you feel during the day? How much caffeine do you consume? What happens is, if we don't sleep for long enough or not well enough, it means that the body and the brain don't restore as well as they should and could. And that, amongst other things, impacts on our cognitive performance, including our situational awareness, our decision making, and sort of almost like how we perceive ourselves. And there's a beautiful study from almost 20 years ago where they, I have to remember this now, they had a group of people who slept for 8 hours, 2 weeks, they slept for 8 hours. Then they had a group who slept for 6 hours, a group who slept for 4 hours. Yeah. And I think one group, they were only 2 days, they didn't sleep at all. And during the study period, all of these groups had to say or rate subjectively their performance level. And they also had to do objective tests, reaction time tests, right, to assess their performance. And what you see is that with the 4 and 6 hour group, subjectively, for the first few days, they said, oh yeah, I'm getting tireder and tireder. And then it plateaued out. They said, oh no, my tiredness doesn't increase, despite getting too little sleep. Objectively measured, their performance decrement just got worse and worse and worse, right, over the course of the 14 days. So what that shows us is that our own ability to accurately assess the impact of sleep deprivation is hindered exactly because the brain is impacted upon.
Yeah.
Right. So anyone who tells me, you know, I drink X many cups of coffee and, you know, I drink it late in the afternoon, in the evening, and I can sleep. Of course, you know, everyone is different and la-di-da-di-da. But I will ask more questions because of, yeah, how lack of sleep impacts on the brain.
Yeah, so they almost fight their own corner, don't they?
Yeah.
So you've got someone who subjectively can't, you know, they perceive that they're still performing, but they're not. But they're convinced that they are because of the concurrent effect that everything's had on them. Yeah, it's amazing. And I think I read a study about subjective perception of themselves. Again, I might be mixing them up here, but I'm sure I read something which was similar, where they deprived them of a certain amount of sleep. And again, 3 or 4 groups, I can't remember exactly, but it was, and this was self-perception. It was how they felt about themselves. And there was this, with the lack of sleep, there was actually real negative connotation with how they perceived themselves, and, you know, how well they felt, and how they looked, and how they appeared, and everything. And again, obviously in today's society, it's a massive thing to, you know, people's self-perception. And again, we're, you know, in our industry, it's very image related. There's a lot of stuff there that's, you know, and psychologically can massively impact people. So sleep, get your sleep in. I think that's probably it. So obviously this is your specialist area. You've got a fantastic book on it, which I have here, Sleep Sense, which I'm going to give you my little review of it. It's a very logically thought out, and again, you know, you can, I'll let you come back on me on this, but it's a very logically thought out. There's a lot of reiteration of kind of common sense practice in there. I think it's a fantastic book for anybody who's looking to improve their sleep. I think there's, you know, it's great that there doesn't appear to be anything in there that's kind of out there. It's all very sensible. It's all very logical. There's a path that kind of goes through it. I think you could probably read it out of order to some degree. I think it would always be best, like any book, it's always best read start to finish. But I enjoyed it. But it was a lot of reinforcement of the things that you should be doing, and also just similar to the conversation that we've had, is there's a lot of stuff that sort of says, look, that there is a logical reason to do this because it is going to benefit you in this way. And I think with anything like that, there's got to be a bit of belief in the process and the outcome, because I think there's so many subtle things that add up when we talk about sleep, and when we talk about all of these things that I think get biologically dismissed, you know, light and sleep and all these things we kind of take for granted. And I think there's so much stuff there that when stacked on top of each other, and we get all these things kind of right or better than they were, I think they have a massive effect. So I think it's a fantastic book for, you know, anybody who wants to just understand that process and how that gets from start to finish. And obviously this is what you do now. You consult with people, and again, I'll let you expand on sort of who you deal with and the type of people you deal with. But you've got Somnia as well. So tell me a little bit about Somnia and what Somnia is about, and ultimately what you do.
Yeah. So thanks first of all for the book review. It's great, and it is exactly common sense. And what I try to do there is, in effect, help the reader, you know, develop a rhythm again, because everything in the body is rhythmic. Everything in our external world is rhythmic. Seasons, daylight. It's just to find your own rhythm and then live according to that, you know, as much as it is possible. That's really the aim. But yeah, coming back to Somnia, what I do, I work predominantly with people who struggle to sleep, either to fall asleep, or they wake up in the middle of the night, or they wake up too early, and helping them getting their sleep back on track. And sure, there are things, you know, around the night we look at, but to come back to this also in the daytime, right? What's going on, because you've got the entire waking day to prepare for your nighttime sleep. And that relationship between sleep and wake is bidirectional. What I do in every day impacts on my sleep, and my sleep impacts on the day. And just to come back at the moment, what you said about, you know, sleep and sort of own self-perception, how I perceive myself, and how I look. Exactly, that's one of the big things for my clients, right? My insomnia clients, is this sort of how am I during the day? That's often the biggest problem. It's, you know, horrible to be awake at night, but the biggest pain point is how they are, how they feel, how they perceive to be in the daytime. That's what I would say is the biggest pain point for most of my clients. And yeah, so what we do there is, you know, devise strategies, behaviors to help them. And a big part is awareness. If I don't know what's going on, I don't know what to change, right? So that's what it starts. And that's where for me, mindfulness is an important part. Not that you have to sit every day and meditate for 45 minutes, because, you know, for most people that's not possible. But you can bring a mindful awareness to your everyday life, and that's the key. And that goes back to, you know, pausing, checking in with oneself, and then depending on what data we get back, so to speak, we then work on ways. Okay, where can we make changes?
Sorry, tickle again. I'll just make sure that I'm not going to squeak or anything as I speak. So if people want to get in touch with you, if people have problems inherently with their sleep, and obviously, you know, this is your specialist field, this is where, you know, you thrive and you do your thing. So if people want to get in touch with you, where's the best port of call for them to find more about what you do, you know, to get in contact with you, to be able to procure your services as such?
The best is just to go to my website, which is somnia.org.uk, and then just drop me an email, and I will respond, and then we'll take it from there. That's the best way. Wonderful.
Well, thank you for your time today. I'm sure we could go down a million different rabbit holes about various bits and pieces, and there's so many topics around this subject that I think, you know, we might do episode 2 potentially in the future if we can dig into some other things and maybe explore some more of the research. But thank you so much for your time. I know that your time is hugely valuable, as is everybody's, and thank you for your expertise. It's been fascinating from a personal perspective as well to speak to someone about this particular topic, as it's something where, you know, there aren't that many specialists on it, there aren't that many people who are as well educated as yourself on it. So it's been wonderful having you on, and thank you for your time once again.
It was an absolute pleasure, and it is such a vast field, and so yeah, I enjoyed all the different turns that we took, because it's just all so relevant. So yeah, thank you for inviting me for having me.
Thank you. Speak again soon.
Bye.
Bye for now.